Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
At my own baby shower, right in the middle of the one moment where everyone had finally stopped talking over each other and the attention was actually on me for once in my life, my sister stood up, clinked her glass loud enough to make people turn their heads, and with the fakest wide-eyed excitement I've ever seen, announced her engagement. She did it like she was on some reality show, with the dramatic pause and the hand over her mouth, and then, as if she had just dropped the most delightful little surprise, she turned directly to me, winked in front of everyone, and said, "Guess it's my day now." The worst part wasn't even that she said it, it was that the room actually laughed, like they thought it was some kind of harmless, sisterly joke, as if I hadn't just been shoved right off the stage of my own celebration. I laughed too, but not because I found it funny. I laughed because the only other option in that moment would have been to lose my composure entirely, and if there's one thing I've learned from growing up with her, it's that she feeds off public reactions, so giving her nothing but a tight smile was already my first act of self-preservation. The thing is, my sister, Hannah, has always had this way of making sure she's the center of gravity in any room. Birthdays, graduations, even funerals, somehow, without breaking a sweat, she'll steer the attention toward herself, whether it's with an over-the-top compliment that somehow circles back to her own experiences, or by dropping some sudden, important update that she claims she just can't keep in any longer. When we were kids, it was small things. If I came home with a good grade, she'd suddenly remember she had been chosen for something at school. If I made a new friend, she'd find a reason to warn them about my moods. Back then, it annoyed me, but I still thought it was just petty sibling stuff we'd grow out of. We didn't. Leading up to my baby shower, I had actually worried about a lot of things, whether the cake would arrive on time, whether people would get along, whether I'd be able to get through the whole day without crying from hormones. But I never thought to worry that my sister would try to hijack the event entirely. She had been cagey in the weeks before, avoiding my calls, not helping with the planning, and showing up late to the few things she was supposed to be part of, like the maternity photo shoot my mom begged her to attend. So when she walked in that day looking like she'd just rolled out of a magazine cover shoot, I told myself to be grateful she even came. That was my first mistake. When she made her little announcement, I caught my mom's face, half proud, half annoyed, but ultimately not about to say anything, and my dad's polite clap, the one he does when he's just going along with something to avoid making waves. My in-laws looked confused, my friends glanced at me to see how I'd react, and I just smiled as if it didn't matter, while inside I could feel this cold, slow burn starting in my chest. It wasn't just the fact that she'd stolen the moment, it was the deliberate nature of it, the way she'd waited for the exact second when all eyes were on me to snatch that spotlight, knowing full well I couldn't make a scene without looking like the hormonal, jealous pregnant sister. I remember thinking that maybe I could let it go, that maybe it wasn't worth turning into a family war, but the more I sat there listening to her talk about how she and her fiancé just couldn't wait to start the next chapter, the more I realized she wasn't just happy, she was savoring the win. She was watching me the way someone watches a glass teetering on the edge of a table, waiting for it to fall, hoping for it to fall. And that's when something in me clicked. If she wanted to turn my day into hers, fine. I would let her. But she was not going to keep it. After she finished her little speech, people actually toasted to her engagement, clinking their glasses as if that had been the reason for gathering all along. My shower turned into an impromptu celebration for Hannah, with people asking her about wedding dates and colors and dresses, and I sat there answering questions about baby names in between her monologues about venues. And the more she spoke, the more I smiled, because every detail she carelessly dropped, the type of ring he bought, the month they were aiming for, the way she just knew he was the one. I filed it all away. She thought she was holding court. In reality, she was handing me ammunition. By the time the shower wrapped up, she had posed for more pictures than I had, collected a round of hugs as if she were the guest of honor, and left early with her fiancé, saying they had celebratory dinner plans that they couldn't cancel. I stood there after she walked out, thanking people for coming, nodding through the awkward apologies from a few friends who said, She probably didn't mean anything by it, and smiling at my mother's whispered, "Don't make this a thing." And I didn't argue. I didn't say a word. Because I already knew I was going to make it a thing, just not in the way anyone expected. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the moment she winked at me. That wink wasn't a slip. It was the same smirk she's given me for years at my graduation party when she told a story about how she tutored me through high school, at my engagement dinner when she joked about how she almost dated my husband before I met him, even at our grandmother's funeral when she whispered that Grandma had always liked her best. That wink was a trophy lift. And in that instant, I decided she was going to learn what it felt like to have something ripped right out of her hands. I didn't tell anyone, not even my husband. The less anyone knew, the better. People can't spell what they don't know. And when I closed my eyes that night, I had already started mapping it out in my head, step by step, what I'd do, what I'd need, and exactly when I'd strike. Because if she thought she had stolen my day, she had no idea that by doing it, she'd just handed me hers. The morning after the baby shower, I woke up to a phone full of notifications, and for a moment I thought maybe a few people had sent me sweet follow-ups or pictures from the day, something to soften the sting of what had happened. But instead, I saw Hannah's face plastered all over my social media feed, smiling in multiple angles with her hand out, showing the ring, tagged in my own baby shower album like the entire event had been staged as her engagement party. Friends from high school who hadn't spoken to me in years were commenting things like, "Congratulations," on my post, except they weren't talking to me, they were tagging her, and the irony was so sharp it almost felt like a physical jab. She had even changed her profile picture overnight to one of her holding a glass of champagne at my shower, like she had taken the photos for exactly that reason, and I remember just sitting there, staring at it, feeling this odd combination of disbelief and recognition, because it was so on brand for her that I couldn't even call it surprising. I called my mom, thinking maybe she would finally admit it had been out of line. Maybe she would say she'd spoken to Hannah and told her to at least give me some space to enjoy my moment, but instead she launched straight into that gentle, exhausted tone she always uses when she wants me to back off, saying things like, "She didn't mean anything by it, and you know how she is, don't take it so personally," as if being the kind of person who steals your spotlight is a quirky personality trait, rather than a calculated move. I pointed out that Hannah had tagged herself in my baby shower photos, and my mom laughed like I was being overly sensitive, telling me it was probably just a funny sister thing, and that people would still know the day was about me. That was the moment I knew my parents were going to protect her from any real consequences, the same way they had 100 times before, and that if anything was going to be done, it would have to be me doing it. My husband tried to play mediator, telling me that getting into a full-blown fight with my sister over this would only make me look bad, that people would think I was jealous, that I should just focus on the baby and let it go. And maybe under different circumstances I would have considered that advice. But this wasn't just about a ruined afternoon. It was about years of her getting away with it, years of her finding ways to take whatever moment I had earned and bending it until she was the one holding it in her hands. Letting it go now would mean letting her set the tone for every big event in my life going forward, and I was done pretending it didn't bother me. So I did what I've always been good at when I decide I'm not going to play nice. I started listening. Not just hearing, but really listening, because Hannah talks a lot when she thinks she's in control, and in those rambling monologues are always the little details she doesn't realize she's giving away. I remembered how at the shower she had mentioned that her fiancé, Mark, had been planning the proposal for months, but that he'd been nervous about picking the right ring. And I remembered her bragging about how they had already put down a deposit on a wedding venue even though the date wasn't public yet. She had said it like a flex, like she was so far ahead of the game compared to me and my last-minute baby plans, but all it really told me was that there were things in motion I could interfere with if I chose to. I didn't need to do anything reckless or messy. I wasn't interested in starting rumors or making public scenes, because I knew from experience that the most effective way to get to Hannah was to make her feel like her perfect plan wasn't as airtight as she thought. So I spent that afternoon making a few casual phone calls, asking harmless questions that didn't sound suspicious on their own, but gave me exactly what I needed: confirmation of her venue, confirmation that they had not yet secured certain vendors, and even a little tidbit from someone who mentioned Mark had a bit of a past with dating apps that maybe Hannah wouldn't want to think about right now. By the evening, I had a short list of exactly where her confidence was resting and exactly how to knock it out from under her without anyone being able to say I had done anything cruel or openly hostile. It wasn't about revenge in the loud, movie-style way. It was about precision, about hitting where she least expected it so she'd have no choice but to think twice before trying to humiliate me again. The thing about people like Hannah is they're so focused on controlling the narrative in the room that they forget about the conversations happening outside of it, and that's where I was going to live for the next few weeks, not making scenes, not starting fights, but gathering every piece I needed to build the one moment that would flip the balance back in my favor. When I finally spoke to her that night, she was still riding the high from the day before, talking about how everyone was so happy for her and how it had been such a fun surprise to share her news in front of the whole family. She threw in a casual, "I hope you weren't mad," in the same voice you'd use to ask someone if they minded you taking the last cookie, and I gave her the same answer I'd given her 100 times before in similar moments, of course not. Because I knew that letting her believe I was still playing the role of the agreeable sister was going to make what came next all the more effective. I hung up that call with a kind of calm I hadn't felt in a long time, because now I wasn't just reacting to her, I was setting the stage. And if she thought she had been clever taking my day, she had no idea that I was already building the exact moment when I would take hers. The morning after the calls and the condescending reminders to let it go, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup I never drank from and a list I had built the night before. A quiet little roadmap that did not involve screaming or accusing or embarrassing myself online, because what I wanted was not noise or chaos. What I wanted was the kind of clean, undeniable pressure that makes a person hear their own doubts louder than anyone else's opinion, and while Hannah flooded her feed with more photos of her hand, her ring, her grin, and the caption about "best day ever," I was finalizing a package that looked, at a glance, like a thoughtful wedding planner starter kit, the kind of sisterly gesture people would praise me for if they ever saw it. Except inside the binder there were sections that did not exist in any bridal magazine because they were built from something a lot more practical than color palettes or centerpiece ideas, namely dates, receipts, public screenshots, and simple questions written in my own handwriting that you cannot easily misinterpret when you read them alone at your kitchen counter. I did not hack anyone, I did not pay for anything shady, and I did not manufacture fake accounts, because I did not need to. I used what Hannah had given me with her endless talk. And I used what anyone can see when they are not busy protecting someone from consequences. So the first tab of the binder was a printout of the venue's public calendar that shows tentative holds and confirmation deadlines. Not because I planned to ruin her booking, but because I wanted her to notice that we are locked-in story can unravel fast when you realize there is a date by which you have to pay in full or the space goes to the next couple, and the next tab was a very simple spreadsheet of vendors she had bragged about basically locking down, with placeholders that, according to their own emails to curious brides, still had open availability. Then came the tab I knew would land the hardest, labeled in plain marker as "Things You Should Know," which contained screenshots from a local women's group many of us quietly use when a guy's behavior throws up a red flag, a group that encourages women to share public information about men who message multiple people with copy-paste lines. A group where Mark's name appeared more than once with posts from before their proposal and, more concerning to me, a couple from after, each with dates stamped on the corner by the platform. Each with innocuous, but unmistakable details about where he works and what neighborhood he mentioned living in, and, to make sure it did not feel like an attack from me, I printed the posts exactly as they appeared, usernames blurred but timestamps left clear, because I did not need to add commentary. The material speaks perfectly well on its own when you want to hear it. Tucked into a pocket at the back was a small envelope with a plain note card that said only this, written slowly so there would be no confusion about tone. Decide what you want to know before you set your date. And under that single line, I wrote 3 simple prompts that I would have wanted someone to give me if the roles were reversed. Namely, have you seen his notifications? Have you asked him to deactivate everything with you watching? And do you want to find things out from me today or from someone else tomorrow? Because I was not out to humiliate her in front of strangers. I was out to make sure she could not pretend she had no idea, and although some people might call that cruel, I call it respect in the only language she understands, which is certainty and control being stripped away without a public scene to distract from the truth. A courier dropped the package at her apartment mid-morning with a signature requirement, which meant I knew exactly when it landed in her hands. And even though my phone had been blowing up with her ongoing posts and a few tags from people congratulating her in my comment sections, the feed went quiet for a little while after the delivery alert hit my email. Quiet in that particular way you recognize when someone who loves the audience suddenly needs privacy, and then, after a stretch long enough that I could imagine her flipping pages in the order I intended, my phone rang with her name on it, the call coming in not with anger or a breezy little joke, but with the kind of shaky breath you hear when a person wants you to tell them what to think because they know if you don't, they are going to have to make a decision they cannot blame on anyone else. She started with the script she has always used when she wants control back, saying she knew I was trying to ruin her happiness, that the posts were out of context, that this was just how men are, and that I had gone too far. And while I could have argued point by point, could have told her which screenshots were posted before the proposal and which ones were posted after, could have pointed out that the messages used the same opener she had showed me months ago when she bragged about how he had been relentless, I did not, because arguing would have given her somewhere to put her anger besides where it belonged, so I told her, in the calmest voice I could manage while she cried and sniffed and demanded I fix what I started, that I was not trying to ruin anything, that I had gathered only public information she could have seen herself, and that if it were my engagement I would want this binder in my hands before I bought a single dress or gave a single deposit, which was the first moment she went silent long enough for me to hear the paper shift on her end, as if she had turned back to the tab with the prompts, and was rereading them like they might change if she stared hard enough. I did not tell her what to do with it, because the best way to make Hannah dig in is to corner her, and I needed her to feel, maybe for the first time in a very long relationship with control, that no matter how loudly she performed her joy online, the decision about her life had to be made off stage, so when she asked me between those gulping breaths if I was happy now, I said that happy was not the word for it, that what I felt was tired and strangely relieved, because at least now we were looking at the same page instead of pretending different stories were unfolding, and if she wanted to hand the binder back to me and ignore it, I would take it and I would never bring it up again. But if she wanted me to stand next to her while she asked him the hard questions, I would do that too. No cameras, no witnesses, just 2 sisters making sure the truth showed up before the flowers did. She hung up without deciding, which I expected, because deciding in the moment would have forced her to admit that something had cracked, and people like Hannah do not show cracks, they repaint, they stage. They turn the camera to a different angle and tell everyone the lighting was bad, and I let her have that space, because the binder had not been meant to solve anything by itself. It had been meant to shift the ground under her feet just enough that she would stop dancing on my table and start watching where she stepped on her own, and as I put my phone face down and finally took a sip of the drink I had forgotten, I sent one text, not a lecture, not a gloat, only a line that I knew would settle right where it needed to. If you think that was me trying, Hannah, you might want to save your tears for later, because as much as I wanted to believe she would walk away from a man who could not respect a proposal week, I also knew my sister loves a stage more than she loves a mirror. And I had already reserved a very different kind of spotlight for the day she has always insisted would be hers. In the days that followed the binder and the shaking phone call that ended without a decision, Hannah did what she always does when the narrative threatens to spin away from her, which is to pick up the camera, hold it high, and flood the world with certainty until the people around her start parroting it back. So suddenly there were posts about cake tastings and gown appointments and a caption about never letting negativity steal your joy. And even though I knew the binder had landed in the Softest place possible because that little motivational phrase only shows up when she is scrambling. I also knew she would never admit to the scramble. Not to me, not to our parents, not to Mark, and certainly not to the public she keeps groomed and ready. Which meant the next move had to be the kind that did not require her cooperation or a confession or a screaming match. The kind that unfolded quietly in a space she believed she owned without resistance, where I would not be the person pointing fingers because the room would do it for me. So when she texted, in that sing-song tone that barely survives translation into written words, that she wanted me to feel included, and would I mind helping with the paper details since I have a good eye, I said yes before she could change her mind. And I took that little foothold she had offered out of habit and turned it into the whole plan, because the stationary touches she dismissed as busywork were the map, the escort cards and programs and table notes that every guest holds and reads and compares without being asked. And if you have ever sat at a table full of relatives who do not know each other well, you know they pass those cards around while making small talk. Which is why I took the design Hannah had approved from the template site and left it completely unaltered except for one tiny line of text that would not raise a single eyebrow until it did, a line placed in the exact spot where people always add a cute quote. And my line said their first message, which in Hannah's mind meant the sweet opener Mark claimed he sent her the night they matched, but in my files meant the same opener he had cut and pasted to every woman he tried to reel in at the same time. And because those messages were public in that women's group and individually meaningless without the pattern, I did not splash them across a screen or tape them to the walls. I printed a different one under each table's note, paired to a date that floats dangerously near the proposal week, and I let the room build the pattern piece by piece. Getting the content right mattered, but getting it in the room without tipping her off mattered more, so I handled it like a professional favor, sent proofs that looked harmless, pulled the approved font from the site, and hired a local print shop under my own name to run the job, which meant the boxes showed up at my door and not hers, and when I brought them to the venue on the morning of her wedding with the same calm I used to bring casseroles to family holidays. No one stopped me because I was the sister doing a task she was known to do well, and if you have ever watched a bridal morning, you know that half a dozen people set down stacks of paper without anyone reading them because the air is thick with hairspray and nerves. So I tucked the programs into the basket, slid the escort cards into their little holders, and placed the table notes under the chargers so they would be discovered when people sat, the way the venue coordinator told me guests always find them. The only other piece I needed was contrast, a bright, almost tacky affirmation that everything was fine so people would not know they were holding a match until it lit, and for that I did not have to lift a finger because Hannah did it for me. Swanning into the bridal suite with those practice squeals aimed at bridesmaids, posting a story where she said today is about love and truth, which almost made me laugh because while she was filming that tour of her happiness, Mark was downstairs in the groom's room holding the same phone he had used to fish for attention from strangers, and that is the part people always miss about men like him. They rarely stop because someone asked nicely. They stop only when a room goes quiet and the feeling changes. Which is exactly what I was building, and I wanted that quiet to arrive not with a screech of tires, but with a slow, dawning recognition that the details they were reading did not line up with the story they had been told. I had told myself all week that I would not waver, that I would not slip back into the role of peacemaker at the last minute just because the dress was zipped and the photographer was snapping. Yet when my mother took my hands and said in that trembling voice that this day was important and could I please not start anything, I felt the old training flare up, the urge to swallow and smile and say of course, and I almost did. I almost collected the cards and ran them back to my car and let Hannah have her picture-perfect lie, except then I remembered the binder sitting somewhere in her apartment under a pile of makeup palettes, the one she could have used to protect herself and chose to ignore, and I remembered every wink, every joke dressed like kindness, every time she used my life as a backdrop for her show, and I thought, if she wants a show so badly, then she can have one that tells the truth without me raising my voice. Guests began to arrive in waves, that soft murmur you hear when people greet each other and scan the room, and the first clue that my plan was working came not from a gasp or a shout, but from the kind of low, curious questions people ask themselves when a detail catches. A bridesmaid saying to a cousin that her table note had a message opener almost word for word like the one she had once received from some guy who claimed it was spontaneous. A groomsman turning his card and pointing out the date on his note seemed a little too close to when the engagement had supposedly been finalized. A pair of aunts comparing their table notes and laughing at first, because men are predictable, and then not laughing as the similarities stacked into something that did not feel like a coincidence at all, which is exactly when the current shifted in the room, subtle but strong, like a change in pressure before a storm. Except no one could point to me as the thunder because I was seated like everyone else, my hands folded, my face neutral, and every eye that flicked in my direction slid right off because I had given them nothing to catch, only paper and dates and his own words. When the procession music finally started and the crowd stood and turned and whispered about how beautiful everything looked, even I felt a slice of guilt that I had set this fuse. Because Hannah is still my sister, and there is a part of me that remembers the nights we used to fall asleep talking about who we would marry and what kind of lives we would build. But that part has been living under her heel for so long that I had almost forgotten it deserved air, and as the doors opened and she walked in with that smile she wears like armor, I told myself that if she had taken the binder seriously, today would not be collapsing under a handful of printed sentences, yet she had decided that the audience mattered more than the truth. Which meant I was simply handing the audience some truth and letting them decide what to do with it. And then, as the officiant opened his book and spoke the solemn words about vows and honesty and the joining of lives, the buzz in the room did not die. It softened into something wary and electric, and when he reached the part where tradition invites objections, I looked straight ahead and kept my mouth closed, because I had done everything I needed to do, and I did not have to say a single word to make the room ask the question for me. When the officiant reached that ancient line that people love to quote and almost no one expects to hear tested in real time, the air in the room tightened in a way you do not notice in photos and you cannot capture in a highlight reel. Because it did not arrive as drama or shouting or the kind of spectacle my sister has always secretly craved. It arrived as a slow wave of shared doubt rolling from table to table as guests glanced down at the little notes they had been comparing like harmless party favors, and then looked up at the two people standing in front of them, and in that pause, the kind that makes the back of your neck prickle because you know something true is about to surface whether anyone invites it or not. Hannah flicked her eyes across the aisle toward me with that familiar warning look she saves for moments when she thinks I might embarrass her, and I held her gaze without giving her a hint of what I would do, because the point of everything I had set in motion was that I did not need to perform, I only needed the room to be fully awake. Mark tried to bulldoze the silence with a grin and a squeeze of her hands, the kind of public affection that works on people who want to be reassured rather than convinced, but the officiant, who was older and careful and clearly accustomed to reading rooms before words, did something I did not plan and did not need to stop. He cleared his throat and said he would allow a moment if anyone needed it. Not because he suspected a scandal, but because he could feel that collective breath hitch and in that half-beat Hannah's maid of honor, a woman who has known me since we were teenagers and who is brave in ways my sister does not always notice, leaned toward her and said in a voice low enough to be kind and loud enough to be heard by the front rows that if there was anything either of them wanted to clarify before vows were said, there would be no judgment from her for asking. Which was the exact kind of lifeline people say they want and almost never take when the audience is watching. Hannah did not take it at first. She smiled that hostess smile and told the officiant to continue, but the murmur did not fade. Because a cousin near the center had already whispered to his wife that the opener printed on their table card matched a message his coworker complains about getting every few weeks, and a bridesmaid at the aisle had quietly shown her note to a woman in the second row who stared at the date and then at Mark like she was trying to line up a timeline in her head, and across the room an aunt read her card again and then frowned toward the groomsmen as if waiting for one of them to smirk or flinch, which none of them did, because even the men who knew nothing could tell the mood had turned from sparkle to scrutiny. I had promised myself I would not speak unless it mattered, not because I was afraid of my own voice, but because I wanted the weight to come from the pattern, not from me. Yet when Hannah's eyes came back to me a second time, smaller now and less certain, I realized that part of justice is offering a clear door out when a person is too proud to build one. So I raised my chin just enough to signal I would stand, and when the officiant nodded, I did not deliver a speech or an accusation. I asked a single question shaped like a favor and wrapped in the language my sister had chosen for her own story. Mark, would you mind telling the room the first line you ever sent Hannah? The exact words. Because she has always said that message changed everything, and I think it would be beautiful to hear it from you. For a sliver of a second, barely a breath, he looked delighted, the kind of man who believes he is charming and assumes any spotlight can be turned to his advantage. Then he saw what I had seen a dozen times in screenshots and a handful of times in my own inbox years ago, which is the moment a man realizes that the thing he repeats to everyone is the one thing he cannot convincingly claim as an intimate memory. And he stalled, and he stumbled, and in reaching for something poetic, he landed on a line that two different women in the third row had already read on their table notes, and one of them put her hand over her mouth not for drama, but the way you do when your body makes the choice to react before your mind has decided whether to be angry or sad. Hannah heard the catch. She always hears the catch, because her entire life has been a study in reading the temperature of a room and bending it toward herself, and while she kept her smile in place like a lid on a pot, her fingers tightened on his hands and she asked, too brightly and too quickly, whether he wanted a minute to think, which would have been generous if it had not sounded so much like a defense, and the officiant again did what older, careful people do when they sense the truth. Trying to arrive, he suggested they step aside for a private word, and the two of them moved a few feet away while the guests stared at flowers and floorboards as if averting their eyes could make this less public. I did not follow them, I did not push, I did not even look hard, because this was never about catching a man with a trap or shaming my sister with a mic drop. It was about pulling the curtain high enough that she could no longer pretend the light was flattering when it was simply bright, and while they whispered with their heads close and his jaw clenched and her brow pulled inward the way it does when she is doing math she hoped to avoid, a groomsman on the end shifted and cleared his throat, and told the officiant he would be right back, then walked the long way around the chairs toward the back doors, not for drama but because he knew, as men always know about their friends, when a story is about to break and no one wants to be seated in the splash zone. When Hannah came back to the center, she did not look at me, which I expected and did not take personally. She looked at the officiant and said in a voice that was steady enough to convince a stranger and shaky enough to worry anyone who had ever loved her that she would like to pause the ceremony and take an hour, that the guests could enjoy the cocktail service early and she would be grateful for their patience, and while some people groaned because schedules are stubborn and hotels do not hold rooms for emotional detours, most faces softened with relief, because no one wants to clap for something that feels wrong, and the staff began moving with that quick, quiet grace good venues train into their teams. Redirecting bodies and pouring drinks like this had always been the plan. I stepped back from my chair so my parents could reach me with their eyes, and my mother did what mothers do when the child they favor needs rescuing. She started to form a sentence about how this had gone far enough and how I should help smooth it over. And I let her talk until she ran out of steam because she could not name the thing I had done besides ask a man to remember a message he claimed was singular, and when she finally said my name like a plea, I told her I was available for whatever my sister needed in private and unavailable for pretending in public, which ended the conversation without shouting and without the kind of scene that becomes family folklore, and I watched my father, who has survived decades of our family's performing, nod once with the quiet resignation of a man who knows the truth always collects its debts eventually. In a small room off the hallway, away from the music and the bar chatter and the clink of glass, Hannah closed the door and did the one thing I had hoped she would do, not for my satisfaction, but for her own future. She asked him to unlock his phone and sit beside her while she opened the apps she had refused to look at when the binder arrived, and although I did not stand in that room, I did not need to, because the sounds that carried through the thin wall, the gasp that is not theater, the Questions without punctuation, the dull scrape of a chair as someone stands too quickly, told me more than any transcript. And 15 minutes later my sister came out pale and composed in the way you are when the adrenaline runs out and the decision has been made and the performance is over, and she took my hand with a grip that was not affectionate but grateful. And she said a sentence I will remember longer than anything she has ever posted. I am calling it off today, and I am going to hate you if you smile. I did not smile. I told her I would handle the announcements so she would not have to field 100 versions of the same question, and I told the coordinator we would need the microphone for a brief address that would not require details. And I walked back into the reception space and said, in a voice steady enough for the room to borrow some strength, that the ceremony would not continue and that the couple would not be taking questions, that guests were welcome to eat and drink and wish my sister well in whatever she chose to do next, and that anyone who thought love cannot survive a paused wedding had not lived long enough in the real world, which landed not as gossip, but as permission to be kind. And the tension that had been building all morning exhaled into something human. Later, when most people had left and the staff had boxed the extras and my parents had run out of sentences and Mark had collected his friends and gone wherever men go when a mirror finally shows them a face they cannot charm, I walked Hannah back to the bridal suite and handed her a small bag with the only gift I had planned for this hour, a stack of vendor letters I had already drafted with cancellation language that would recover as many deposits as possible if she moved quickly, a referral list for 2 counselors who specialize in relationships ending under public pressure, and the name of an attorney who can draft a clean agreement about her apartment without turning it into a battlefield, all packaged with a plain note that said, "Your day belongs to you when you protect it," and she read it without tears because the crying had already been spent, then put the papers back in the bag and nodded once like a woman signing a contract with herself. People will say I burned her wedding day down because I could not stand to share the light, and those people can keep that version if it helps them sleep. What I know, and what she knows no matter how long she tries to stay angry, is that she tried to take my baby shower and turn it into her engagement, and I turned her wedding into the first day she told the truth to herself, and if there is a ledger somewhere that counts these things, then I am at peace with the math, because the next morning, when my phone buzzed before sunrise and her name lit the screen, she did not call to rage or bargain or accuse. She called to say that the silence in her apartment felt clean for the first time in months, and that she had made 3 appointments from the list in the bag, and that she did not need me to forgive her right now because she was busy forgiving herself, and I said the only honest thing left to say, which was that she had wanted it to be her day, and it finally was, just not the way she thought, and if anyone asks me years from now whether I went too far, I will say that I went exactly far enough, because sometimes the most generous thing you can do for someone who loves a stage is to turn up the lights and let them see it.